Today we are officially launching the online page of the handbook, and the event today you'll get to hear from Majbritt Lyck-Bowen, who is the author of the handbook, as well as other practitioners that have their examples as good practices in the handbook. So to not waste any more time, we will have a nice opening from Loraine Masiya Mponela. She is a migrant rights campaigner and community organizer from Malawi. She lives in Coventry as a refugee. She's a mother, a mother-in-law, and a grandmother. She's the author of 2 poetry books that give a voice to asylum seekers and refugees in the UK. Her first book, I Was Not Born a Sad Poet, was published in October 2022. And her second book, Now I Sing, 50 Poems to Celebrate 50 Years, was published in January of 2024. So Loraine, the floor is yours, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much, and I feel privileged to be here. I will share with you a poem, and this poem is called I Am a Product of Many Communities. I am a child of many communities. I belong here. I am a sister, not just an asylum seeker. My little voice has become a speaker. I use it to channel my thoughts since 2016. I have fully been accepted by groups and organizations with alacrity, fighting for basic human rights that so many take granted for. I filled my days with activities driven by purpose. I realized that many wanted my opinion. I found peace for my overloaded brain, got immersed in the freedom train. My mind grew bigger, eager to help others, moving away from the selfish strain. I heard my own voice initially from deep inside of me. I spoke for others. Boldness became my vessel, transporting me to greater levels. Community helped me find my feet. My eyes were opened, realizing that we are all one, a community, tied together at the hip. I live in Coventry, the city for peace and reconciliation, still recovering from the traumas of the Second World War. Just like Coventry, we are all in recovery mode, seeking meaning as we watch our bodies bit by bit retire. Thank you.
Thank you, Loraine, for that beautiful poem. And it's so much more beautiful that it comes from your direct experience. We really appreciate you being able to share your poetry with us, and it is an absolute pleasure. Now that we have had this beautiful opening, I would like to give the floor to the QCEA Director, Tracey Martin, who will give you a better overview of today's event. The floor is yours, Tracey.
Thanks, Feblezi, and thanks, Loraine. It's a great reminder of some of the things that are in the handbook about the importance of agency and also the unnecessary hardships that many people face when they migrate. So yeah, I'm Tracey. I'm the Director of Quaker Council for European Affairs. So I just want to say a little bit about how this handbook came to be. Quakers have long worked on peace and realized that peace isn't something separate from other issues. It's very closely integrated with other issues, human rights and justice. And it's about addressing violence in all aspects of human existence. We've also worked for quite a few years here at mainly with the EU and the Council of Europe on migration. And in 2022, we read Peace Direct's publication, Migration and Peace Building, which outlines how local peace builders are crucial in preventing forced migration, and how the involvement of migrants is vital for peace processes. And this set us on a journey about exploring the links between positive peace approaches, so approaches that seek to end all kinds of violence, not just physical violence, can change and really help us to look differently at migration practices. So the current dominant approach to migration, we feel, is broken. It not only perpetuates and increases violence and violates human rights, it also creates a climate of fear, increases militarization, and in many circumstances denies denies communities the benefits that migration can bring. So the handbook is aimed at both policymakers and practitioners. We hope that policymakers will see it as an alternative. That's what we wanted to offer, an alternative to the way things are now, because many people think there aren't alternatives. And that practitioners will use it to reflect on their work and think about the different kinds of violence and how they can reduce that. Of course, ideally, we'd like the whole approach to be taken on board and to change things, but we know that in the current situation, that's unlikely. But we think that any move towards a positive peace approach will help to shift the system. So we're delighted to launch Moving with Dignity, and we hope that in this launch you will hear a little bit about it, but that you'll take some time to explore the website afterwards. So I'm going to hand over now to Dr. Majbritt Lyck-Bowen, who was the consultant who worked with us on the handbook. And she's going to, it's been a real pleasure to work with her because she is somebody who knows a lot about both peace building and migration. And she'll tell you in a lot more detail about what the handbook is about. So I'll hand over to Majbritt now.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to get my PowerPoint going here. Okay, can everyone see that? Yeah. So today I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the handbook. And it is really literally just going to be quite a brief introduction to everything we've been trying to do here, because I think you will see that it is quite a complex area. So forgive me if I'm not going to be able to cover everything you'd want, but this is definitely going to introduce you to some of the main ideas. So first of all, I'll have a very quick look at why we need this approach now. Tracey's already given a bit of the context of the current context, but I'll add a few things to maybe why a positive peace approach is the thing. Then I'll give you a very brief overview of some of the thinkers in peace building that have informed this positive peace approach to migration. So we will look at Galtung, Lederach, Bowie, and Hudson. I'll be coming back to who they are and what the kind of key concepts that they have. And then finally, we're going to have a quick look at some of the key aspects of this approach. I'll dive a little bit deeper into some of them and see how they affect policymaking in the different kind of contexts that we'll be looking at. So I think there are many different reasons why we need a new approach, and there is a whole chapter in the handbook that looks at what is going wrong in the current system. But I think some of the things that a peace approach particularly can take, and particularly a positive peace approach can take, is that it can embrace really the complexity and the interconnectedness between, on one hand, violent conflict and peace building, and on the other hand, migration. Because I think so far, quite often those have been dealt with quite separately, especially migration hasn't been dealt with. And it's not just from a migration point of view, it's also from a peace building point of view. I think peace building theories have not always looked enough at what migration actually, the importance of migration in those contexts as well. So I think looking at it from a more interconnected perspective is going to be very helpful. I also think that a peace approach offers a different, as we will see in a moment, a different view on violence and a much broader understanding of what violence really is and how it impacts people's lives as well. I think so far there's been a lot of focus on physical violence, but there are, as we will see, there are other kinds of violence that are impacting people's lives as well, and that might make them consider migration as their only option. So we'll be looking a bit at that as well. I also feel that there's sometimes not enough focus on the whole journey that migrants do. And again, I think here peace building can have that, because in peace building, we look at why a violent conflict happens in the first place, all the way through to how we can try to get people together again after the violent conflict has ended. So again, a kind of longer perspective, I think, is important as well. I also feel at the moment, and this is maybe from a personal point of view as well, I started this journey some 25 years ago. And when I started this journey, we talked about peace building in other countries. We talked about peace building in places where there had been a violent conflict. But nowadays, we actually talk about peace building everywhere, because we see some of the tendencies that we have seen in other countries where it has led to violent conflict. Some of those tendencies we now have across the board, basically. So I think that's really important to keep in mind as well. Some of them are, for example, there's a tendency at the moment to dehumanize other people, to dehumanize migrants, to not see them as fellow human beings. We can see that with the way things are reported in the media, for example. There's also a higher and rising, very concerning level of far-right ideologies at the moment. Again, tendencies we have seen in other countries that have in the end led to violent conflict. And there's many issues around hate speech and hate crime, not just against migrants, but against other groups of people as well. So I think there are lots of the things that we see in the current context that really, where peace building can really help. So that's why one of the reasons why I think we have to look at it from a positive peace point of view. So what do we then mean by positive peace, and what does it really entail? So we'll start by looking quickly at Galtung. Johan Galtung was a Norwegian sociologist, and he is seen as the founding figure of peace studies. So he developed several different concepts, but one of the important concepts he developed was this division of different kinds of violence. So he focused on direct violence, which is the physical violence that is committed by, planned and committed by organized groups. So this is the kind of violence that we see when we see in the television from a war situation, for example. And he was basically arguing, he was working in the 60s. So he was basically arguing that until that point, that had been the focus of any kind of studies of war, basically. So we were looking at it mostly from a direct violence point of view. But he was saying that there were other kinds of violence that were important to look at as well. And one of them was structural violence. And structural violence are not something that we can see with the naked eye, but it's structures and systems that are that we have everywhere, and that means that some groups are disadvantaged. So it can be that they don't have equal access to education or food and shelter or the political system, for example. He also argued that it's important we look at a concept called cultural violence, and this is really the ideas, the norms, and the values that people use to justify why it is okay to commit direct violence and structural violence against certain groups. So why is it? It is things like prejudice, for example. So we use them to justify why we should treat certain groups less in less fortunate ways than others, and why it is okay to deny people access to some things, why it is okay to exclude people from something. So these were the kind of 3 different kinds of violence he defined. And he then used them to make a distinction between, on the one hand, negative peace, on the other hand, positive peace. And he was defining negative peace as the absence of direct violence. And that's what he said had been the focus so far. So far, we had been happy as long as there was no physical violence between different groups of people, we would declare the war was over, and we would declare that as peace. But he was saying that was far from enough for people to live happily fulfilled lives. So he was saying in order for that to happen, we have to eliminate structural and cultural violence as well. So it's a much broader understanding of what violence means and how it impacts people. Keeping in mind that his application of these different concepts was made in situations of violent conflict, we have included another part of positive peace as well, because we don't think it is just enough to not have direct violence in a country. We think that there's also a lot of the violence that goes on, for example, people being murdered in the streets, something that happens everywhere. We think that that's an important thing an important kind of violence to look at as well. So we define that as violent behavior. So that's something we have added to Galtung's ideas about positive peace. So for us, the handbook really focuses on this much broader understanding of violence as direct violence, structural violence, cultural violence, but also violent behavior. So it has a broad understanding of what violence means. moving on to Lederach. So Jean-Paul Lederach is an American faith-inspired peace builder with lots of practical experience, especially from Colombia. And he wrote a book in 1998. And one of the kind of groundbreaking things about him was that he is focusing on the local level. So until then, there was really this general idea that as long as you had a political system, as long as you had economic structures at the top, at the national level, peace would trickle down to the bottom and people would come together at the bottom. He's saying that's not the case. We have to focus on the local people as well. And local people have to be involved in every aspect of everything we do, basically. And part of that is also to make sure that whatever practices, whatever policies you make are really sensitive to the particular local context. He was saying that's important as well. He was also bringing attention to the importance of developing and strengthening relationships between different groups of people, but within different groups of people. And finally, he also focused on reflective practice, which is quite a broad, it's a very broad concept he has. But for us, it means thinking about curiosity, thinking about being open-minded, and thinking outside the box. So it's about the approach really asks us to think beyond what we normally would think, so to speak. Be open-minded, be open to change our understanding of things, and be curious about it as well. Okay, so we're going to also quickly have a look at Heidi Hudson, who is another peace builder. She's from South Africa. And she focuses a lot on ideas around agency. So she's saying we need to focus on people's agencies, people's ability to act. She's also emphasizing the importance of understanding that everybody has knowledge, understanding, and skills. So from our point of view, every migrant comes with knowledge, understanding, skills, experiences that we all have to value. We have to find ways of valuing. And she's also saying that we need to think about, in terms of participation, we need to be very aware of people's positionality and their identity. So she is bringing attention to how, for example, belonging to a religion, belonging to a particular ethnicity can disadvantage us in certain circumstances. And it can mean that our voices are not so much heard. And she's saying that this especially focuses on the role of women in this. So we're looking at that in the handbook as well. And finally, she's also asking us really to look at things from a post-colonial lens. And I think this is really important in migration, something we haven't done enough of yet. So, for example, quite often when we talk about migration, we talk about it from a European perspective, from a destination country perspective. Notwithstanding that most refugees and migrants actually settle in countries outside of Europe, not looking at what is actually happening in the countries that people are moving from, what is happening in the countries that people are returning from. So one of the things we'll be looking at here is also how can we try to move away from looking at it from a much more narrow perspective, really, because she's really asking us to, again, open our minds. And finally, we're looking at Loraine Masiya Mponela. She's peace activist from Liberia. She was very much involved in the peace building process there. And she draws attention to three things, really, I think, that are important in this context. One, she sees women as initiators, change makers, and leaders. So again, she looks at the inclusion of women. Two, she focuses on the importance of non-violence. So she's saying we have to be very careful about not making situations worse in everything we do. And we have to really, with every initiative we take, we have to try to reduce the different kinds of violence. And three, she's also drawing attention to, in some contexts, not always, but sometimes it can be helpful to draw on faith-based values and to draw on the resources of faith-based communities. I think the Pope was a good example of that. I was very happy to see him, for example, in his Easter message, draw attention to some of the violent conflicts that the world has forgotten about. Okay, so this is then the kind of 10 most important things about the approach. I will not have time to go into all of them. I'm going to dig into a couple of them, but you can have a look at them yourself. I would highly recommend that you read the chapter, basically. There's one chapter that sets out the whole approach, and that goes into all of these. And these are also the key messages that you will find in the very beginning of the handbook as well. So I'm going to dig a little bit deeper into a couple of these. So first of all, what will be very important in this approach is that we will be trying to eliminate or committing to eliminating all kinds of violence. So direct violence, violent behavior, structural violence, and cultural violence. So of course, this is not something that's going to happen overnight. It's a long-term vision, but that's really what the approach really centers on. How can we get to that point? So what will be important is that we look at how a policy, when we're talking about different policies, that whenever we make a policy, we are thinking about how will it affect the different kinds of violence, and how can we make sure that it is actually reducing those different kinds of violence. So, for example, if we were in any country, if we were trying to, if we decided on policies that would decrease youth activities, for example, we need to think about what kind of effect will that have on violent behavior and direct violence. If we were looking at, and this is, I think, is another important issue, is that when we talk about policy making, the approach asks us not just to think about what happens in our own country, but also what happens abroad. So when we make a policy in our own country, that also has at times implications abroad. So that's another important aspect. But for example, a good example of that is like the international weapons trade and how that affects direct violence in some of these countries where migrants are coming from. So at the moment, there's a lot of weapons being exported, for example. There's a lot of weapons that have, Afghanistan is a brilliant example of that. A lot of weapons have been left behind, and that is now creating more violence. So thinking about how decisions that we make is actually affecting the countries where people are migrating from is important. So key question here really is, how can we develop policies that really try to eliminate all the different kinds of violence? Another good example, another thing that's key to this is really that we would need to commit to eliminating forced migration. So we need to get to a point where people are not going to, where migration, we're not eliminating migration, but we are eliminating forced migration. So we're still saying if people want to move voluntarily, that's absolutely fine. But we're trying to make sure that people are not feeling that migration is the one and only option for survival. Basically, that's what we're aiming at here. So again, as an example, for example, when we talk about policies, if we in a country decide that we don't want to focus on conflict prevention in local communities, for example, how does that then affect the direct structural and cultural violence, and how could that potentially lead people to feel that forced migration is the only option? So one of the things we will be looking at here is, for example, local mediation services. So if we decide, again, decisions that we're making in one country has impacts in other countries. If we decide that we are going to reduce humanitarian aid, how is that, as many countries are doing at the moment, how is that then going to affect the levels of violence in other countries as well? Structural violence, for example, there will be more structural violence because there will be, in many cases, there will be less food, there will be less money for shelter for people. So there will be an increase in structural violence because some groups are no longer going to be able to receive humanitarian aid. So again, that's important. So again, we'll be thinking about how can we develop policies in all these different contexts that people really don't want to, that people don't feel that they have to move away from. So they can decide that they want to do it, but they don't feel that this is the one and only survival strategy. This approach will also mean that we are trying to normalize migration. And I think there's an interesting point here, because we have already in some ways normalized some parts of migration. We have normalized, I live in the UK, for example, and here it is completely normal to move to Spain when you retire. So immigration has been completely normalized. It's also normalized to move to other countries to work, for example. But the immigration bit, people arriving to the UK, has not so far, or is being challenged at the moment. The normalization of that is being challenged at the moment. So the approach will also suggest different ways we can try to normalize migration, to see it as something that people do as part of their everyday life. So here we would, for example, be thinking, if you were in a country of destination, we could think about how can we make policies that ensure that migrants are treated the same way as everybody else in the labor market, that there is no, and again, it's not just the structural part of that, it is also the cultural part of that. So how can we make sure that there are no prejudices that are, for example, hindering people from accessing the labor market? once they have got a job, how can we make sure they're treated the same way as everybody else is treated? Also, how can we, again, another analogy, I think, when we talk about the countries of transition, we have, for example, I find it interesting the way some countries are treating migrants that are transiting through the country, as opposed to the way that you are treating tourists that are also transiting through your country. So again, how can we make sure that policies support the safe and the safe travel of migrants that are transiting through countries? How can we normalize those journeys? So basically, how can we develop policies that support the normalization of this? Also, really part of that process will also be to have to create more safe regulated pathways as well. So how can we make sure, again, if you're looking at it, and again, I think it's important that we don't just look at this from the destination point of view. Again, it is a journey for people. So how can we make sure that the countries of origin are geared up for that as well, have policies that will support that as well? And how can we make sure that that trip is safe all the way through? Also, we're also looking at here in this handbook, we're also looking at people returning to their countries again, because I think that's another important point, is that migration is not necessarily something you do for life. It might be something that you want to return to your country as well. So how can we, for example, if a country, for example, has recovered from a violent conflict and things are getting better, how can we make sure that the return of migrants is an important part of that process as well, of the peace building process in those countries? How can we make sure that there is, again, it needs to be emphasized that this is a voluntary return, but how can we make sure that if people do want to return to a particular countries, that they can do that in a safe way as well? Okay, and two more things quickly. Another point that is very important in peace building, and that would be important for this approach as well, is really how can we make sure that we have migrants participating in the whole process of developing policies, of developing projects, of developing different practices. So the handbook will give some advice as well about how can we make sure that we are really including people. And we're not just talking about the kind of consultation bit that we normally have. We're talking about how we can really make sure that, again, we use the skills, we use the experiences, we use the ideas, the concepts that migrants come with as well. So again, we would ask for people to think about when they are designing a policy-making process, how can we make sure that that participation is really active, meaningful, and intentional? And the handbook will explain what exactly we mean by that and how that can be done. Finally, we will also look at, the handbook also looks a lot about developing relationships, which is another really key aspect of this as well. So in terms of policies, we would ask for people to think about how a policy impacts the development of relationships. So relationships should be key in everything we do. Bringing people together, especially at the moment where there's a lot of division in many communities and where the division seems to be growing. We need to think about ways we can bring people together again. So how can we support policies where relationships between in countries of destination, for example, that brings migrants and the people and communities together? Again, the handbook has lots of ideas about how that can be done. Also looking at it again from in countries of origin, how can we, for example, make sure that we how can we make policies that support relationships between returning migrants and the people and communities that decided to stay? So how can we basically develop relationships between all the different groups of people? That again needs to be a key aspect of policy making. And I think that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Majbritt. I think that was a very great presentation, considering that this is indeed a very long handbook. We will end it here with Majbritt, so I just want to give you a thank you immensely for joining us in this online launch. To inform the participants, we will be having an in-person event both in London and in Brussels coming up later, so you can keep an eye out for that. And Majbritt will also be attending both of those, so feel free to attend, and you can, if you are able to attend, you'll be able to engage directly with Majbritt. But again, thank you very much for your presentation. And now, since we had the question of good practices, I would like to welcome our next two speakers. First, we have Matthias Wevelsiep, Director of Programs and Operations at Finn Church Aid and the Network for Religious and Traditional Peacemakers. And then later we will we'll hear from Eliane Maes, Coordinator of the Humanitarian Corridors of the Sant'Egidio community. These two practitioners offer insights into two of the good practices included in the handbook. So before I waste any more time, Matthias, the floor is yours, and I will share the presentation.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you also for the invite to this, and indeed a really interesting handbook. Really good to listen to the presentation, and had a chance to look at it a little bit beforehand as well. And many topics indeed are incredibly relevant also to the work that we are currently doing. So. My name is Matthias Wevelsiep, Director on the Network for Religious and Traditional Peacemakers, working, I guess, pretty much across the triple nexus, to just bring one more terminology in. So somewhere between development, humanitarian work, and peace work, with a focus though on peace. I do a quick introduction to Finn Church Aid and the network, just as background, and then I move into the topic itself. So next slide, please. So these are the two things that I kind of have to mention. So I'm working with the network NRTP, and basically what we do, we're working with insider mediators. Often they're called religious or faith-oriented insider mediators, so coming from a faith background, and we're working with them on peace processes. We do that broadly speaking, in especially Horn of Africa, but also elsewhere in Africa, in the Middle East, and in Asia. More recently, Europe was getting more prominent there, and these are then certainly elements that we are focusing on. We are a membership organization, and we do work with, for example, the Quakers as well, and we do work also with have been had experiences with Sant'Egidio earlier. Not surprisingly, talking about these topics. The network is actually hosted by Finn Church Aid, which is one of the bigger development cooperation and humanitarian organizations in Finland. So we always brag about being really big in Finland, but then once we are going back to indeed, for example, European or global context, we are medium size. We are focusing especially on peace, quality education, and sustainable livelihoods. And our programming is probably, between those three themes. More recently, we have been moving to different ways of framing our programming to also capture well enough the kind of changes that are happening around the world. And those are, for example, often captured through the work of youth on the move, also youth in waithood, and the question of migration, therefore, is also quite prominent. So Finn Church Aid is actually hosting the network, so I'm wearing these two hats in parallel, so to say. And feel free to check out our website for further details, or ask questions later on offline if you like. Don't want to waste too much time on that. So next slide, please. So today I'm talking about two things really. One is about insider mediators as our core concept that we're using in our peace work, and then later on some concrete practice examples of this work. So on this slide now, I will walk you through some of what do I mean with insider mediators. Who are they? What are they doing? And how are they helpful in the work that we are doing? I think starting point would need to be especially the question of insider mediators as being always present in those societies where we are working. And we, I mean, now, for example, as Finchurch 8 or as a network, they're usually very deeply rooted in those communities and are very well positioned in those societies. So in an ideal situation, there may be a faith actor with good access to different parts of society. However, ideally, not being formally part of the, let's say, political system. So, of course, we have examples where, you know, a faith actor may also at the same time be a politician, or maybe prime minister, maybe, you know, what have you. In the insider mediator concept, what we're trying to see are people with access, but who are not actually in day-to-day politics, and through that are often kind of very well positioned to kind of be creating positive changes in those societies. Actually, going back to the handbook discussion and some of the points that were coming up earlier, I think the question of localization, the question of like actual or kind of real participation are quite well linked to insider mediation, because those actors are not, well, as the name says, they're not coming from the outside. They are not the third-party mediators who are coming into certain contexts, but they are people who know the fabric of society extremely well, can interpret it, can navigate it. And I think these are really, really important actors for peacemaking. I think what makes them interesting as well is to look at it from the question of, you know, there can be women mediators, there can be youth mediators, there can be faith-based mediators, but all are insider mediators. So from the society, you know, that we have, for example, an intervention or a program on. I think those kind of actors we have noted are often very good in reaching out to outsiders, new arrivals, you know, different people, you know, arriving to a context, and that's why I think there's a great potential. This probably is featured in one way or the other also in the handbook, of understanding insider mediators as a way to also bringing in, you know, different actors coming from the outside. I think societal glue is one of those terms that has been used, and obviously then we go back to the whole question, okay, what is society? What is power within that society, and those kind of questions, right? So insider mediators would be able to indeed bring those actors together, and that may especially be helpful also for migrants. And I guess here the being an insider, being an outsider can mean very different things. So if you have a women mediator, you may have a different type of access than, for example, a faith mediator in that context. And indeed, you may also be a connector to other groups just because of your position. And I think this will be really, really important to note. Finally, I think it's good to note that there's this whole migration experience, which can also be seen as a strength of the mediator. So many of the insider mediators themselves have been exposed to forced migration, or indeed have been migrating for multiple reasons. And I think that those are good examples for us to consider. So with all of that said, I'm now jumping into some examples here that are hopefully resonating, at least on the level of further discussion. So next slide, please. So I have two examples here that I would like to highlight for our conversation today, and that, of course, great if we can have further conversation later on. One really important example has been Uganda, and with any examples, I have to say, when it comes to positive peace, you will not find any perfect country. So whatever example you'll be using, you will find the critique on certain dimensions of positive peace, and then you might find an element of positive peace that may be helpful. I think what has been noticed is that Uganda has been doing exceptionally well on welcoming South Sudanese refugees, and I think what makes this case specifically interesting from positive peace point of view was that you have had allocation of land plots, of actually access to start, building your home, actually building materials, as well as, financial support to start in agriculture work, which is quite fascinating, because I think it's fairly far away from the kind of things we would see in European context, for example. Again, being in Finland right now, with myself also having a German context, quite often there are many steps before you're able to, well, in this case, for example, have access to land, build your own home, engage in agriculture. That's just really far away from many of the practices that we see elsewhere. And I think this is probably a good example of where the question of migration and positive peace could also be linked. Okay, what are fairly concrete basic steps that are possible to be done in order to help those migrants to get started, and this is also related to a lot of the work that Finn Churchill is doing. For example, we are doing work on education in emergencies, so you would have actually had at least quite big education support projects there as well. And I think this is an interesting, relevant international example to look at. Okay, how could this be approached in fairly concrete terms? And again, we need to realize Uganda is not a extremely well-off country. So even though these may be small support actions, they still are actually quite heavy lifting for a country of that kind of starting point. Second example, and then I'm sure I'm running out of time quite quickly, but I think it's an important one to note when we're looking maybe at the whole question of Syrian civil war, forced departure, terrible transit, on different pathways to Europe, and then, for example, ending up in Germany. I think, again, Germany being an interesting point there, because I think in the early days, there has been a moment where Germany maybe had some sort of a attempt to indeed welcome refugees. So you had a term, Willkommenskultur, which was coined back then, which sadly didn't last, and turned quite dramatically to a different direction, which you probably can argue with some of the AfD support that you see now in Germany would maybe actually even be related. But why I think it's an important point, you still would see that there has been Syrian civil society support, even in Germany, possible, and you had insider mediators from Syria themselves as migrants being present, for example, in Germany. And now we have a situation where some of those migrants are actually going back to Syria. Now, this is not la la land. We know that things are not going well, but you could argue, well, maybe things are not going as bad as they could, and you could maybe even try to at least find elements there of how positive peace of departure from Syria journey, what has been happening in Germany, even on an informal level as a Syrian group itself, with a potential return now as in some level at least a possible positive example to be recognized. Final point from my side, only to say that really much appreciated the work that is done on the handbook. I think we can have a long debate about decolonization, especially looking at the question of narratives that that entering the sphere right now. I think it, for me, ultimately really important to have that conversation, especially about power and international power, and how that is utilized, and how can we as civil society find a counterbalance there to come up with hopefully better avenues for positive peace. That to say, this far for now, but we're happy to answer questions later on if there's time left. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthias. It was a lovely presentation and great hearing about indeed the potential of community, and especially inside a community, in having a positive peace approach. Now I'd like to give the floor to Eliane Maes, coordinator of the Humanitarian Corridors of the Sant'Egidio community, who will give us more insight into the Humanitarian Corridor example. Loraine the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you so much. I have somewhere a PowerPoint presentation. Maybe Feblezi, if I may kindly ask you to handle it for me, because you did it so well with the last speaker. So thank you so much that you invited me here. I'm Eliane Maes. I'm from the Sant'Egidio community. I'm based in Brussels, and I'm the coordinator of the Humanitarian Corridors project, one of the coordinators here in Belgium, in Brussels. Yes, here we go. Okay, all right. So, yes, I want to start my presentation with this picture, especially the sentence that is written on it: a safe and legal solution for the migration dramas at European external borders. Because Tracey mentioned it earlier, the migration approach that we see now is broken. And we from Sant'Egidio, we had a little bit the same feeling. The approach is broken. We need to look for a different way, a more human way, a more peace-centered migration policy. And we were triggered. It's been a while because our Humanitarian Corridors program is on since 2016, but we were triggered by the big tragedies we saw in the Mediterranean Sea here in Europe, starting more than a decade ago in 2013. If I can have the next slide. In 2013, there was a vessel trying to cross the Mediterranean with 368 people. A small selection you see here on this slide. And these people, these victims of the crossing of the Mediterranean, they are our motivation to keep going. Because we see also that the public opinion and the policies, they have stopped to reflect before those terrible unjust deaths. And allow me to quote briefly our late Pope Francis, who called it the globalization of indifference. The Pope was and still is a big inspiration for the community of Sant'Egidio, and we asked ourselves the question how not to be indifferent, how to reverse the attitude of how to defend ourselves against migration. But we want to ask us the question how to rescue the people, how to save them, how to prevent so many deaths, how can migration also contribute to the development of departure and host countries. And then I'm also thinking of the demographic transition that has produced a dramatic decrease in working age adults here in Europe, also in Belgium, where I'm from. Because we see for every 10 people that going out of the labor market now, only 8 come back in. If you go to the next slide. Yeah, migration is of course a very complex phenomenon, but it's a reality and it must be governed. If migration is accompanied by valid paths of integration, it can be a powerful engine of prosperity from which we can all benefit, from economic migrants, refugees, growing of population of countries of destination. And we from the community of Sant'Egidio, we are an architect and we are also witness to this. Like I said, our program, the Humanitarian Corridors, were established in 2016 as a response to the increasingly dramatic situation in the Mediterranean Sea. Today, I must be said that this initiative is very timely and very necessary because the shipwrecks in southern Italy and Greece sadly attest to way too many victims. That disaster should never have happened, and everything possible needs to be done to ensure that it will not be repeated. That's why with Humanitarian Corridors, we try to build bridges for children, for women, for men, for the elderly, fleeing from unstable and gravely dangerous situation, trying to cross safely, legally, and with dignity in European countries. These corridors cross borders and, more important, break down the walls of indifference. that have shattered the hopes of so many people who have waited for years in painful situations. So the humanitarian corridors are a success story of welcoming refugees. We launched it together with Sant'Egidio, with the Waldensian Table and the Evangelical Federation of Churches, in collaboration with local governments, and in Belgium also with other churches, Protestant churches, but also with the atheists, the Muslims, and the Jewish community. It is a little bit unique here in Belgium. And since 2016, we can say that we welcomed 7,934 people. So I think nowadays maybe 8,000, because I have the digits from February this year. And we had a couple more groups coming to Belgium. So I think maybe we're already over 8,000 people. If we can have the next slide. I have here some numbers. Unfortunately, I didn't have the time to translate it to English, but I hope it is not too difficult in Italian. So of the 7,934 people that we welcomed in Europe, 6,800 and so on went to Italy, because Italy still is our biggest country, where also the community of Sant'Egidio is the biggest. And then you see in the right corner, Belgium and France, the two other big countries where we accept refugees. And we had a couple smaller projects in Andorra, in Switzerland, and in Germany. But for now, these are not running. So we tried to do there something, but unfortunately, we didn't manage to continue. So our main countries that we work with, as you see, are Syrians. 55% of the entire people that we helped are from Syria, mainly through Lebanon, because there are lots of refugees, Syrian refugees in Lebanon, while Lebanon is not really a big country. It's 3 million inhabitants, and they suffer gravely under the weight of so many refugees. Another country that we work with is Pakistan for Afghan refugees. Afghanistan, unfortunately, is one of the poorest countries in the world, where there is a never-ending war. We opened a corridor in Pakistan, especially for women and for families or for men who have collaborated with Western organizations, because many of them fled to Pakistan. And then also we are active in Ethiopia and Libya, where besides the Ethiopians and Libyans themselves, we help a lot of people from other countries that are kept inside refugee camps with no hope of any future. Also think of Yemen, Sudan, Somalia, Chad, and Congo, who are caught in war and conflicts. So millions of people there end up in huge camps where they were often treated more like animals than as humans, unfortunately. So next slide, please. So each of one of those almost 8,000 refugees that came to our project deserve our attention, because they had a lot of difficult experience. I spoke with many of them. I know several of their stories. We come in contact through the potential participants through different channels. Through our own channels, because we are present on the ground, but also through other referrals, through people contacting us to be part of the program. We meet every individual or family at least 2 or 3 times. During those meetings, we explain clearly how the program works, what it would mean for them, because it is not a free ticket to Europe. It is a clear commitment to start a new life in a new country that welcomes them. Obviously, it's also a moment to listen to them. It is because they went through a lot, and it's important that also that we understand their story. And this is very important to figure out the story of each individual, of each family, because if we believe that people are able to come to Europe for two reasons, when we think that their personal situation is eligible for the program, then we can start making a file with the reasoning why we think this. And then we can offer it to the government, because in the end, it's always the government that has to give us permission to bring people to Europe. And the second reason, and one of also an important reason, is based on the information that we gather on the families abroad, we have to match them here locally in Belgium or in France or in Italy with a support group or a supporting committee, how we call it. Because this is also one of the very important parts of our program. Next slide, please. Yes, so this picture, you saw it in the beginning. This is how we welcome people in Europe. This picture was taken on the airport of Brussels in Zaventem. And you see all the people, mainly with the blue jackets, are from Sant'Egidio, are also the support groups. So Sant'Egidio and its partners, we welcome every individual, every family, the moment they touch the ground in Europe. It's very important for us that everyone that arrives here feel welcome from the beginning. Next slide, please. So I now focus a little bit more on what we think is the most important part of our program, and that are the support groups, of how it's also called sponsoring. And sponsoring, it's nothing new. Maybe it is new in Europe, but it is known in Canada for some time. And sponsorship is just a modality to grant regular and checked access. In this way, migration is managed and not suffered. Sponsorships avoid human trafficking, dangerous journeys, overcrowded centers, issues of integration, and also good management of people cases. In our program, like we said, we call the groups that take over the sponsorship supporting committees. Those supporting committees represent a cornerstone to our program. Every newcomer is assigned to such a supporting committee. They find a temporary housing for them, they welcome them, they guide them through all the new things that they encounter here in Europe. And also because of the support group, we see that every family, they integrate better, they integrate faster. I have here a couple of figures that we managed to get out of, that we calculated. So almost 100%, 95% of all the adults that arrive here in Europe attend language courses. So I think that's very nice, it's very beautiful. And also a lot of manage them within 1 year of arrival to go to their next house. Considering the housing crisis in Europe, that's also quite impressive. And also some of them, 20%, manage to start working. It may seem not a lot, but for 1 year, it's a lot. Especially, I speak from the Belgium side, we have long waiting lists for language courses. So also it slows down the entire process. Without a language, you cannot start working. That is unfortunately the reality. If I have a little bit more time, then I can go to the next slide. I will go fast because I see that I'm at time pressing. So I want to show you a couple of examples of families. So the picture on the right is the family that we encounter in the refugee camp in Lebanon. Like you see, we really go to the places where they live to understand who they are, what their story is. And on the left is a little boy who was not able to walk because he has a medical condition, but now he lives in Belgium, and because of good medical care, he is now able to walk. So that's really one of our success stories. So, and if you go very fast, I think the last slide. Yes, voila. So I have to finish here because I see that Feblezi is looking at me. Just the look to the future, a couple of small things. We did a research about our humanitarian corridors program. It's called HUMCOR. and it is a guideline on how to organize humanitarian corridors, on how to do this. I think also it was used for the handbook. I have it also. It's a document. I can you can find it online. I put the link there. And yeah, what we want for the future, very briefly, we want to have more sponsorships programs, and also we want to scale up the quotas. Because for Belgium we had 250, and we are finished now, and we hope in the future that we have more. But we understand that it's going to be very difficult. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Eliane, for this great presentation. I think you gave a very good overview of what it means to have safe, regular pathways through this humanitarian corridor. Again, Eliane and Matthias, thank you very much for your contribution. I look very much forward to seeing you at the Brussels event. Now for the part that I would assume most people are here for, is to discover the handbook. So we're quickly going to go through it together. So here is the handbook. We have obviously access for the full publication if you would like to read. Currently, as it was mentioned, it is only in English, but we are accepting or asking for volunteers who are able to translate any chapters or any parts of the book, of the handbook, that is more pertinent to your work. We have the 10 key takeaways. So these are summaries, I would say, of the entire handbook and what are not necessarily the recommendations, but the key highlights to think about in different aspects of work that work in different contexts. Because as Majbritt had explained earlier on, the handbook is divided in terms of the different contexts, whether it's country of origin, country of transit, country of destination, but as well as country experiencing violence and country not experiencing violence. So these are the main key takeaways. As you go below, we have the introduction and conclusion, which it gives a very brief understanding of what's in the handbook, and what's most important is therefore our chapters. So there are 8 different chapters that you can explore independently, because they all address different aspects of a positive peace approach and a different application of positive peace approach to migration. Each chapter contains numerous examples. So depending on your interest and your work area, feel free to have a look through everything and take into consideration the key recommendation or the good practices that were highlighted, as opposed to recommendations. And finally, we have a video from Majbritt that you just heard from, who answers more directly certain questions about how the handbook came about, the purpose of it. So this webpage will be going live in a couple minutes to hours. We will be sending you the link to the handbook, after this event for you to have a read through. And as I mentioned, we are accepting help translating into different languages. So this is a very brief overview of the webpage. As we add more resources, we will be adding them directly onto this page. If you have any more questions and comments and feedback, we have a contact email that you can reach through us directly. Again, the handbook is free, so consider this as a great tool in your work practice or just as a general interest. Since we have about 5 minutes left, I will now welcome back Tracey, who will give us a lovely closing. And in the meantime, the floor is yours, Tracey.
Thank you so much, Feblezi, and thank you for keeping us all on track and guiding us through this session. Just to finish, just a couple of things. Some of you may be thinking, But is there going to be a print version? Because I know some people still prefer that. We do think that the web page will be the main place to access for things because it's a little bit more flexible. We can add more resources, we can add translations easily, and people can find the bit they want fairly easily. But we will be having print versions. They'll be ready for our in-person launch in Brussels, which is on the 13th of May. And I think Selena, if you go back through the messages, has already put a link to register that if you are going to be in Brussels. We are also hoping to have a UK launch, probably at Friend's House in London in June. So if you're in the UK, look out for that. And tomorrow we have, so our hope, people asked about other launches, and our feeling is, you know, the best people to launch the handbook in a different country or a different place or for a particular audience are the people who are most connect with that audience. So we're reaching out to people who work on migration in different places. If you'd be interested in hosting a launch, either online or in person, then you can get in touch with us and we can support that happening. And it's the same thing for translations. We know that some people might think, okay, I'm really only interested in destination. I'm really interested in that chapter. I'm in a country, Germany, France, wherever, and I think there are lots of people who'd be interested. So we'd like to talk to QCEA about translation. And that may mean that you do it yourself or that you find somebody to do it, or we work together to try and find funding for that to happen. So it's really trying to, it's like bringing it out into the community to gauge the interest of what languages people would like things in. And tomorrow, our first kind of collaborator, the World of Neighbours, which is an interfaith network of migration practitioners, are hosting an event, which is also online, and Majbritt and I will be there. And it's focusing particularly on destination and particularly on within Europe, that welcoming refugees, making the asylum processes work for migrants. And I'm just gonna, so that's in the chat. So it's at 5 o'clock tomorrow, Central European Summertime, and there's a Zoom link there for you. If you're particularly interested and like to go into a bit more depth and have more time for questions, maybe after you've had a look at the web page. So yeah, finally, thank you again. Thank you to all our speakers. I really hope that you will help us share the handbook. We will, of course, be disseminating it particularly to EU policymakers, but maybe some of you are best placed to disseminate it to policymakers in your own countries. If you have any questions, let us know. We will send you an email after this event with a short survey, because it's good to know what you think, and also to see if you're interested in translation or doing a launch. And we'll also send you the link to the web page. So thank you very much, and I hope you all have a good rest of your day.